Welcome to Now English Club's podcast. This one is a literature podcast and it's on A Handful of Dust by Evelyn Waugh. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to look at the possibility of an extract question coming your way in an exam. Obviously, I always say to my students, don't focus on an extract question if you can do a whole text question. Because even if you do get an extract question, you still have to show knowledge of the whole text. So that involves usually three references to things that happen elsewhere in the text, which you can compare and contrast to what's going on in the extract, just to show that you have got a complete knowledge of the whole novel. Okay. So this is the question I want to work on. Comment closely on Evelyn Waugh's presentation of Dr. Messenger's experience in the following passage. Okay, so I'm going to read it first and then we'll start analysing it. Okay, so this is the extract. They walked for a fortnight, averaging about 15 miles a day. Sometimes they would do much more and sometimes much less. The Indian who went in front decided the camping places. They depended on water and evil spirits. Dr. Messenger made a compass traverse of their route, gave him something to think about. He took readings every hour from an aneroid. In the evening, if they had halted early enough, he employed the last hours of daylight in elaborating a chart. Dry watercourse, 3 deserted huts, stony ground. We are now in the Amazon system of rivers, he announced with satisfaction one day. You see, the water is running south, but almost immediately they crossed a stream flowing in the opposite direction. Very curious, said Dr. Messenger. A discovery of genuine scientific value. Next day they waded through 4 streams at intervals of 2 miles, running alternately north and south. The chart began to have a mythical appearance. Is there a name for any of these streams? He asked Rosa. Makushi people called him Waropang. No, not the river where we first camped. These rivers. Yes, Waropang. This river here. Makushi people call him all Waropang. It's hopeless, said Dr. Messenger. When they were near water, they forced their way through blind bush. The trail there was grown over and barred by timber. Only Indian eyes and Indian memory could trace its course. Sometimes they crossed little patches of dry savanna, dun grass growing in tufts from the baked earth. Thousands of lizards scampered and darted before their feet, and the grass rustled like newspaper. It was burning hot in these enclosed spaces. Sometimes they climbed up into the wind over loose red pebbles that bruised their feet. After these painful ascents, they would lie in the wind till their wet clothes grew cold against their bodies. From these low eminences, they could see other hilltops and the belt of bush through which they had travelled, and the file of porters trailing behind them. As each man and woman arrived, he sank onto the dry grass and rested against his load. When the last of them came up with the party, Dr. Messenger would give the word and they would start off again, descending into the green heart of the forest before them. Tony and Dr. Messenger seldom spoke to one another, either when they were marching or at the halts, for they were constantly strained and exhausted. In the evenings, after they had washed and changed into dry shirts and flannel trousers, they talked a little, mostly about the number of miles they'd done that day, their probable position, and the state of their feet. They drank rum and water after their bath. For supper, there was usually bully beef stewed with rice and flour dumplings. The Indians ate farine, smoked hog, and occasional delicacies picked up by the way, armadillo, iguana, fat white grubs from the palm trees. The women had some dried fish with them that lasted for 8 days. The smell grew stronger every day until the stuff was eaten. Then it still hung about them in the stores, but grew fainter until it merged into the general indefinable smell of the camp. There were no Indians living in this country. In the last 5 days of the march, they suffered from lack of water. The streams they came to were mostly dry. They had to reconnoitre up and down their beds in search of tepid, stagnant puddles, but after 2 weeks they came to a river once more, flowing deep and swift to the southeast. This was the border of the Paiwai country, and Dr. Messenger marked the place where they stopped, second base camp. The Kaburi fly infested this stream in clouds. So the question would be, comment closely on Waugh's presentation of Dr. Messenger's experience in that passage. some comments you could possibly make is, it's quite surreal in some ways. I think what I would say most of all about Dr. Messenger is this is a man on a mission who is lost. He's totally lost. He's metaphorically and literally lost. I think for comic effect, really, that moment when Wall uses dialogue, well, actually, it's one-way dialogue when he's got Messenger saying, "You see, the water's running south," and then the narrator informs the reader, but almost immediately they cross the stream flowing in the opposite direction. And Messenger, he doesn't admit he's wrong. He just immediately says, "Very curious," and then he turns that into a positive, or tries to, and he adds, "A discovery of genuine scientific value." And this so-called scientist, he thinks he's really at one with the local people as well, because even his chart has a mythical appearance. So I think he's not fully in the world of science. He's a little bit superstitious as well, let's say, but he's certainly not at one with the environment that he finds himself in, because when you think about how he ends up being washed away with the stream and ends up falling down a 10-foot waterfall and bangs his head, and then that's the end of him. So this is not a person who is going to be a legendary explorer. That's what he wants to go down in history as. He wants to be the man who maps the Amazon successfully, but he has no clue where he is ultimately. And what else would I say about it? There's also lots of grandiose words like an aneroid barometer being a non-liquid instrument measuring atmospheric pressure. Does he really need that? I think in a way he's showing off. He has lots of gadgets like the clockwork green mice as well. Talking about techniques that Wall uses, I would say he uses free and direct discourse at times, because the narrator sort of goes into the head of Dr. Messenger at times, and it actually makes him seem ridiculous. It's a technique that's often associated with Jane Austen. And by using free and direct discourse, you can call it free and direct speech, if you will. But Jane Austen often allows the reader to experience exactly what the character's feeling. Even though it's a third-person narrative, we still get inside the head of the character. And I would say that helps us to understand the character Dr. Messenger. Look out for that. Anyway, there's lots in there, I would say, where we sort of flit in and out of his mindset. Okay, so I will now move on to other aspects. I will look at other extracts, but before I do that, I want to look at the whole text and some of the interesting intertextuality that's found in it. For example, there's a lot of Arthurian legend. You may have noted that that Tony Last is a knight of sorts, or maybe he's King Arthur actually, but he's on a quest at the end to find the city with Dr. Messenger. He needs something to occupy his mind after the death of his son, and also the loss of his wife, who's obviously disappeared and decided to hook up with Beaver, and we'll talk about him in a bit. But anyway, Tony Last could be described as a modern failed knight and he's he believes in chivalry. His house is called Hetton, which sometimes sounds a bit like heaven, but is actually a Gothic / medieval fantasy castle. But the problem he's got, Tony Last, is his world is totally empty, trivial, and morally bankrupt. And just going back to the Arthurian legend for a moment, his wife sleeps in a room called Guinevere, and Guinevere, of course, is King Arthur's unfaithful queen. So this already explores the idea of infidelity, and it foreshadows exactly what's going to happen to Tony Last as his wife is unfaithful. Another Arthurian character is Galahad. He's the religious one who actually manages to find the Holy Grail. This room in Hetton is the most uncomfortable room, which sort of suggests sacrifice because in days of old, priests often wore painful, abrasive clothing made of sackcloth, and maybe that sort of links to this idea that Galahad is the room where you show sort of reverence through physical suffering. But ironically, when Beaver actually comes to Hetton, Tony Last puts him in Galahad, so which implies that he's pure of heart. But there's nothing pure about Beaver. He's an opportunist. But as I said, we'll talk more about him in a bit. But anyway, a lot of the rooms are related to Arthurian legends, so do look out for that, because obviously that's got lots of extra meaning, and extra meaning is what really gets you the marks. So these Arthurian references are not decorative, they are ironic and structural too. So anyway, as I mentioned before, Brenda is like Guinevere from Arthurian legend. She betrays her husband, King Arthur, and she goes with his best friend in some versions of that story, Lancelot. And well, obviously King Arthur's really shocked, as is Tony Last. But I don't think Beaver's any sort of Lancelot, because Lancelot was supposed to be one of the best knights that King Arthur had, which made it all the more shocking, whereas Beaver's far from that. So this, anyway, you could call it a direct parallel, but it's so ridiculous that of all people that she should end up with, it's Beaver. And then she also has a tragic ending, I suppose, not quite as tragic as Tony. Right, moving on, again, a bit more explanation about Galahad. What can I say? I think I've said it, actually. I've said it all, that the religious ideals of having a room called Galahad turn out to be hollow, because he ends up putting Beaver in that room. And it's kind of, it goes against the Arthurian legend, because Galahad is a loyal knight, but here he puts somebody disloyal in Galahad. So these rooms are all named after Arthurian legend. And, you could say Arthurian legend's quite romantic, whereas this novel is more about realism than romance, because anytime people have romantic notions, it always seems to be subverted by reality. So, as I mentioned before, Tony Last has a quest. Rather than a Holy Grail, he ends up exploring the Amazon, hoping to find a city, which of course he doesn't find. He finds nothing like it at all. Right, what should I go to now? I'm going to just continue to talk about the characters. Mrs. Beaver, she's a mind of information, and she symbolizes the decline of the aristocrat. She's obsessed with money, social climbing, and survival, and she really is grasping and opportunistic and constantly trying to rent out her rooms. And it shows the opportunistic side of the middle classes. Which quotations do I like the best for Mrs. Beaver? When Mrs. Beaver says about Brenda, she's lovely, he's rather a stick. So she's talking about Tony Last, but it shows what she's ready to judge others. Beaver himself, John Beaver, says to his mother, "Mumsy, you're wonderful. I believe you know about everyone." And then she replies, "It's a great help. All a matter of paying attention while people are talking." So, yes, she's very opportunistic, and we can see that. She's a mind of information. She says, she was talking about Brenda. "I used to see her quite a lot before she married. She was Brenda Rex, Lord St. Cloud's daughter, very fair, underwater look." I quite like this underwater look. It just reminds me of how Dr. Messenger ends underwater. I'm not sure what to make of it other than that. It's almost like, what I would say about Brenda, it almost makes her sound like a mythical creature, like a mermaid. And mermaids, you could say mermaids were like sirens. And if we go with that, so I'm going to put that as an extra comment. Mermaid, siren, these sort of women are, very alluring sailors to their death. So I think that's a really relevant point to make. Alluring sailors, obviously, like a femme fatale, luring sailors to death. And femme fatale, I'm just writing this because I just suddenly thought of that. So femme fatale, that's what I'd say she is. If based on that one description, underwater look. So she also adds, when she's talking about Brenda, people used to be mad about her when she was a girl. Everyone thought she would marry Jock Grant Menzies at one time. Wasted on Tony Last. He's a prig. I should say it was time she began to be bored. They've been married 5 or 6 years, quite well off, but everything goes in keeping up the house. I've never seen it, but I've an idea. It's huge and it's quite hideous. They've got one child at least, perhaps more. So she didn't really care about children. That comes out of that quotation. The information we get, obviously, Jock, who's supposed to be a friend of Tony Last. And I don't think Jock's such a terrible character. I haven't really got much to say about Jock other than that. He has a role to play. He's supposedly an MP. He seems to be, he's really like, I can't even call him a catalyst, but he just sort of links. His role is sort of linking scenes together, perhaps, and he's almost like a messenger. It's funny, we've got a character called Dr. Messenger as well, but Jock's hardly that. Anyway, continuing. So what about Brenda Last? Is there anything more I would want to say other than I've already mentioned Guinevere? Or what does she represent? She becomes bored with country life. She doesn't seem that bothered about her son, because when her son dies, she worries it. The John that's being spoken about is John Beaver. And then when she finds out it's her son who's dead, she says, "Thank God." She does mourn the loss of her son, but not that much, because she's decided, she's opted for a city life rather than a country life, so she's not actually going to see him anymore, or probably not very much. So she doesn't seem that out of sorts by the death of her son. So Brenda represents modernity, selfishness, moral emptiness. What about her lover, John Beaver? Well, the name's interesting. There's a lot of rodents in this novel, and mice, rats. Beaver is a kind of rodent gnawing away at society, I would say. He's socially awkward, he's passive, and he's also opportunistic, which seems to go against the idea of being passive. But he represents a rising but unimpressive middle class. The question his name throws up is, does his character actually beaver away or work hard in any way at all? I'd say not really. He's undeserving of success in love, and it's quite a mystery, really, why somebody like Brenda would be interested in him. We get the information in the text that he lives with his mother in Sussex Gardens, where they had moved after his father's death. Brenda calls his mother odious, and as I mentioned before, Tony Last puts Beaver in Galahad, and the reason he does it is quite ironic. He says, "No one who sleeps there ever comes again. The bed's agony, I believe," which is pretty ironic. As I said, Beaver's not the sort that would have a holy grail unless we're going to call the holy grail Brenda. And I'm not really altogether sure that John Beaver had eyes for Brenda. It's just that it was an opportunity and he took it. And again, his passivity, his laziness, his indolence is all shown by this quotation. He got up late and sat near his telephone most of the day, hoping to be rung up. By contrast to Jock, he's not very popular in Brats, the club that they both frequent. The quotation I've got here is, "He," meaning Jock, "was too young to have fought in the war, but these men thought he was all right. They liked him far more than they did Beaver, who, they thought, ought never have got into the club at all." And then later at the bar, Jock said, "I made Beaver pay for a drink. He can't have liked that." So again, we got the idea that Beaver's very, he's very hard up. He's very mean. In other words, Beaver is a mean, and miserly, like kind of Scrooge type creature. And but he's very, very much an opportunist, because he says to his mum, or who he calls Mumsy, he says, "What's their dossier?" And that makes him sound like he's very, he's not playing things off the cuff. It's all very calculating. So I'm going to add that to my notes as well. Calculating character, because of the word dossier, which obviously is like a file. So the two Beavers, Mrs. Beaver and her son John, both calculating. And then Beaver even uses this word, which is strange for somebody so passive, when the narrative is talking about his relationship with Brenda. The narrative goes, but there was still a constraint between them, and Beaver began to wonder, does she expect me to pounce? So as they waited in a traffic block by the Marble Arch, he leaned forward to kiss her. When he was quite near, she drew back. He said, "Please, Brenda." But she turned away and looked out of the window, shaking her head several times quickly. So this gives you the idea that the word pounce obviously is a predator. That's what I take from that. So despite being a beaver, a rodent, he's got a predatory instinct, which you wouldn't really expect. But I suppose beavers are generally considered quite, they're the sort of creature that no one minds, but actually they're quite dangerous. Okay, so what about Tony Last? He represents traditional English values, nostalgia, moral rigidity. He is blind to the fact that his marriage is falling apart. His loyalty and innocence actually leads to his downfall. And he's described as happy as a sandboy by Brenda, who's speaking to Alan. What I would take from that is, his head's in the sand, really. I think, like an ostrich. And to Mrs. Rattery, who comes over to probably, put his mind at rest to some extent after the death of his son, John Andrew. He says this: "I've never been able to learn any card game except Animal Snap." Well, the irony there, he's got no animal passion. He gets treated like a docile pet. He doesn't have much snap about him, or aggression, and so that, in a sense, is irony. There's so much irony in this as well. What does Jock say to Beaver? He says, what does Jock say to John Beaver about Tony? He says, "I often think Tony Last's one of the happiest men I know even. He's got just enough money, loves the place, one son he's crazy about, a devoted wife, and not a worry in the world." Well, that's an ironic statement, because obviously that all falls apart. He's hardly happy at any point. He has to really leave the country, he feels, because he's going to be, he's emotionally drained. And he needs a quest. And you could argue, I suppose, that he brings it upon himself because he is very innocent. But he calls his dressing room Morgan Le Fay, which is another Arthurian reference. Morgan Le Fay is a magician, usually on the side of bad rather than on Arthur's side. But it really depends on the version. It depends on the version you read, actually, but because there are so many different books about King Arthur. But in some versions, I think Morgan Le Fay leads King Arthur back to the place where he back to the lake, to throw the sword back into the lake. And there are, lots of watery deaths in this, or lots of. Well, there's only one watery death, but there's lots of instances of traveling across water. So it's a bit like Avalon in Arthurian legend, and the Lady of the Lake. There's a lot of water in that too. I'll probably need a bit more time to see the connection there. But Morgan Le Fay, it's quite difficult to say. But my first impression of Morgan Le Fay is it's a very strange name to name a room, a dressing room. It's sort of smacks of disloyalty and far worse, like black magic and so on. Right, John Andrew last. His death is a key turning point. Brenda's letter more or less says that. The letter says, I'm in love with John Beaver and I want to have a divorce and marry him. If John Andrew had not died, things might not have happened like this. So she just blames it all on the son dying. She wasn't even there when he got kicked in the head by a pony or horse, I forget which. So Brenda's got some nerve to use John Andrew as an excuse. And as I said to you before, when she finds out about the death of John Andrew, she's actually relieved it's not actually John Beaver. She says, "What is it, Jock? Tell me quickly. I'm scared. It's nothing awful, is it?" "I'm afraid it is. There's been a very serious accident." "John?" "Yes." "Dead?" He nodded. She sat down on a hard little empire chair against the wall, perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap, like a small, well-brought-up child introduced into a room full of grown-ups. She said, "Tell me what happened. Why do you know about it first?" "I've been down to Hetton since the weekend." "Hetton? Don't you remember? John was going hunting today." She frowned, not at once taking in what he was saying. John Andrew? Oh, thank God." Then she burst into tears. She wept helplessly, turning round in the chair and pressing her forehead against its gilt back. What I've said about guilt, I would pick out that word for analysis because guilt is to do with gold. So it suggests that she's got a mercenary nature. Obviously, so the back of sounds like the back of the chair is, it might not be real gold, but it looks gold in color at least. And she might be secretly pleased that the son is not going to inherit Hetton. And obviously she may feel guilt, the spelt G-U-I-L-T, so it's a homophone. And so it's got a double meaning there, so that makes it a really good word to focus on. So now let's look very briefly at Jock. He's a friend of Tony. He encourages his trip abroad. He's, considered quite a careless character, I suppose. I've already mentioned that he was too young to have fought in the war. Mrs. Tipping seems very interested in him. She says to Beaver, I think, she's talking about Jock, I think he was in Parliament. "Oh, Mr. Beaver, I am so sorry to trouble you. I was wondering, could you possibly tell me the name of the young man you introduced to me last night at Madame de Tromet's? The one with the reddish moustache. I think he was in Parliament." And Beaver replies, "I expect you mean Jock Grant Menzies." "Yes, that's the name. You don't by any chance know where I can find him, do you? So he's loved by the ladies, let's say, based on that. Haven't got much more to say about him. Another sort of not really major character is Mrs. Rattery. This is the quotation that describes her. "Jock's blonde was called Mrs. Rattery. Tony had conceived an idea of her from what he'd overheard of Polly's gossip and from various fragments of information let fall by Jock. She was a little over 30. Somewhere in the Cottesmore country, there lived a long-legged, slightly discredited Major Rattery, to whom she had once been married. She was an American by origin, now totally denationalized, rich without property or possessions, except those that were packed in 5 vast trunks. Jock had had his eye on her last summer at Biarritz in France, and had fallen in with her again in London, where she played big bridge very ably for 6 or 7 hours a day and changed her hotel on an average once every 3 weeks. Periodically, she was liable to bouts of morphine, so that's obviously a pretty strong drug, painkiller. Then she gave up her bridge and remained for several days at a time alone in a hotel suite, refreshed at intervals with glasses of cold milk. Quite why she's trying to help Tony recover from the grief of the loss of his son is difficult to say what is the connection there. But she tries to get him playing cards, and as we've already mentioned, he decides he can't play bridge. He can only play Animal Snap. Anyway, moving on. She's not really good. The one thing I would say about her is her name, Rattery, is quite interesting because, again, you get the sense is, of course, it's not her fault. It's the surname she got from her husband, Major Rattery. But is she rodent-like? I'd say not particularly, actually. Right, moving on to Millie and Winnie. So obviously they have to try to get a divorce, the two, Mr. and Mrs. Last, and it's suggested that Mr. Last, i.e. Tony Last, he should pretend he's having an affair. So obviously this is for comic effect, and he's got, he basically wants to cause a scandal. When the irony is, it's his wife who's actually been unfaithful, not him, and he seems to have zero attraction for Millie, and she brings her daughter with her on this trip, and by bringing a daughter, it makes it seem quite above board. So the security people that are, or detectives that are watching and part of this scam, if you will, they're trying to advise Tony to not make it seem so decent. So they say to him the following: "But Mr. Last, what are you thinking of? You've got to get evidence from the hotel servants." "Well, I didn't like to wake Millie." So he's got more. They've got more evidence of him being with the daughter than actually Millie, who's supposed to be the person he's being unfaithful with. "She's paid for it, isn't she? Come, Mr. Last, this won't do at all. You'll never get your divorce if you don't give your mind to it more." "All right," said Tony. "I'll have breakfast again. In bed, mind. In bed." And he went wearily upstairs to his rooms. Winnie had drawn the curtains, but her mother was still asleep. So he's paying all this money, and he can't seem to secure the divorce. But he's really only doing it for his wife anyway. And in the end, of course, it doesn't really go through. Other characters that are of interest, I would say, as Mr. Todd, who appears at the very end, virtually imprisons Tony Last. So Mr. Todd lives in isolation in the middle of the jungle. He forces Tony to read Dickens endlessly, and he represents madness, imprisonment, and the grotesque parody of civilization, because reading books, obviously, is considered civilized. Mr. Todd says to Tony, "Do you believe in God?" Tony replies, "I suppose so. I've never really thought about it much." Mr. Todd, "I have thought about it a great deal, and I still do not know. Dickens did. I believe in God." And it's interesting how they go through all these Dickens novels. They took down the first volume of Bleak House, Dickens novel, and that afternoon Tony had his first reading. And then to Mr. Todd, what does he say about this novel? His comments on the story were usually simple. "I think that Dedlock is a very proud man," or "Mrs. Jellyby does not take enough care of her children." They had finished Bleak House and were nearing the end of Dombey and Son when the rain came. I think part of the reason why Wall chose Dickens is one, or maybe number one, is that these novels are really long and they were in installments. So it sort of suggests that they never reach an end. And then it continues. They move on to another novel, which is about America, written again by Dickens. Tony resumed the reading of Martin Chuzzlewit, where it had been interrupted. Weeks passed hopelessly. They read Nicholas Nickleby and Little Dorrit and Oliver Twist. And anyway, I would say I'll probably talk about that a little bit more in a minute, maybe right now, actually. So Mr. Todd is isolated, as I mentioned before. So these novels give him some kind of company, some kind of structure, a narrative structure, and some kind of emotional stimulation. And it's a substitute for real human life. And he hasn't really got many books at all. He mentions that some were eaten by ants, so he hasn't got the full Dickens collection. And it seems more about ritualizing life. It's all about just getting through it. It's not about enjoying things Although you'd have to say it does seem that Mr. Todd does enjoy listening to the reading. But Dickens, as I mentioned before, is associated with social life, moral narratives, and civilization, and there's not much of that going on in the middle of the jungle. And it also represents that Mr. Todd has total power and control over Tony. Tony is like his slave. He has to read aloud endlessly. And Dickens becomes a tool of imprisonment and control when actually what it's all about is enriching people's lives and entertaining. So, this idea that reading great literature is a mark of civilization is turned on its head or satirized. So what do these novels have in common? These intertextual references, they're all long, sprawling and serialized, as I mentioned before, episodic, lots of digression. The idea we get is Tony Last is trapped in a never-ending narrative loop. And there's an element of that on his way there when he meets somebody on board the ship, the big vessel that they take across the Atlantic. He keeps bumping into somebody who's literally walking around the deck, but making the most of it. So this repetition and circularity appears a lot in this novel. And other themes that are covered by the Dickens novels are imprisonment and entrapment. Little Dorrit, a lot of it takes part in a debtor's prison. Bleak House, it's an endless legal case going on, Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, and that obviously relates to the legal proceedings going on behind the scenes, which don't seem to go anywhere. Obviously resulting in the end with Brenda struggling with money. She doesn't get the kind of settlement she was hoping for because Tony is away. Oliver Twist, there's an amount of imprisonment and entrapment in that. Obviously, Oliver gets trapped in a gang, and there's the entrapment of poverty as well. Obviously, that's not exactly what's going on in this novel, but it's certainly entrapment. And for Nicholas Nickleby, there is a certain amount of confinement, I would say, with certain characters like Smike. He is confined and abused. So yeah, I think all those novels do mirror Tony's situation. And what else could I say? The ones that don't mirror Tony's situation quite so much, perhaps, not so obviously, Dombey and Son. However, Dombey and Son is about a father obsessed with status and business, but he's also obsessed with his son, obviously. But the son dies, which is exactly what happens to Tony Last. Martin Chuzzlewit is, as I mentioned before, it's about America and opportunities in America, but they don't turn out that well, if I remember correctly. So there's a lot of people getting tricked in Martin Chuzzlewit, and I'd say that the same occurs in this novel also. Basically, the similarity with Martin Chuzzlewit is characters pursue false ideals in the American episodes, but the reality is pure disappointment. And yeah, there's a strong connection, as I said. So let's see, is there any more that I want to tell you about? I've already talked about Arthurian legend, so I'll probably better leave it there because this has been going on quite a while, nearly up to 40 minutes. So hopefully this is useful to you, and please, if you have any questions, feel free to send a message to this podcast.